Hello everyone, welcome to Social Psychology, Psychology 346, and today we're going to continue talking about attitudes. So we've identified what attitudes are and how we form them. Now, how good are they at predicting behaviors? If we know someone's attitudes about a specific object or a person, can we predict how they're going to behave towards that object or that person? Well, for the most part, attitudes are pretty good predictors of behavior, but not always. So generally what we see is that individuals have an attitude towards something. Then they can form a behavioral intention as to how they will behave in future situations related to this attitude. And then they will actually follow through with this deliberative behavior. So I might have a positive attitude towards Heroes. My behavioral intention is to watch an episode of Heroes. And then if given the opportunity, I can then follow through and watch that episode. That's not the whole story, though. We have other influences on our behavioral intentions that can determine whether or not we actually follow through with this behavior. So subjective norms can sometimes prevent us from following through with this behavior. So maybe I want to watch Heroes right now, but it's not appropriate. I might be teaching a class. I can't just stop what I'm doing in the middle of class to watch Heroes. And also, perceived control has an influence. So if we think we are able to perform this behavior, then we're going to follow through with it. If we think we just aren't able to, maybe I'm in my office, I don't have a TV or access to the internet, so I actually can't follow through with watching an episode of Heroes, then I'm not going to be able to actually perform this behavior. So although attitudes are generally pretty good predictors of deliberative behavior, behavioral intentions tend to be the best predictors. They take into account the attitude of the person, subjective norms, and the ability for the person to control their environment. So under what situations do attitudes predict behavior then? Can we figure this out? Well, generally we see that attitudes are strong predictors of behavior when self-presentational concerns are not around. So especially when responses are confidential. People are more willing to behave the way they want to if they can't be identified, especially if it's a behavior that's not socially acceptable. People behave in attitude-consistent ways when they believe that they can't lie. So if, for example, if people are hooked up to a lie detector test, this is what's known as a bogus pipeline. Lie detector tests don't actually predict lines, they predict other physiological responses that can sometimes tell you if someone is lying. But if a person thinks that they can't lie, then they're going to actually behave in ways that are consistent with how they truly feel. Also, we see that individuals behave consistent with their attitudes when social norms are also consistent with their attitudes. So if their behavior is socially accepted, then they're going to follow through with that behavior. If it's not, then they're going to hesitate and maybe not behave in line with their attitude. People also behave consistent with their attitudes when people believe that the behavior is possible. So for example, people may want to lose weight, but maybe they don't think they have the drive or the ability to do so. So they don't follow through with these behaviors. So for example, products such as Lean Cuisine or Subway try and market to these people to say, hey, you can eat healthy, here's how you can do it, it's pretty easy, you just follow these steps. And lastly, we see people behave consistently with their attitudes when the self is made salient. So for example, when people look into a mirror. Simply being aware of the self encourages consistency, attitude behavior consistency, encourages people to live up to their own standards, and encourages people to not lie, basically. They're kind of made aware of ethical and moral issues with not behaving in a consistent manner with their attitudes. So when we do see attitude behavior consistency, this is again predicting more deliberative behaviors. So political attitudes often predict voting behaviors, workplace attitudes predict job applications, college attitudes predict what courses students register in. We do see that attitudes have a pretty high correlation, high consistency with behaviors that people are deliberately following through with. But what about more spontaneous behaviors? So some of the assumptions of this attitude behavior model is that people are rational, and that they make systematic use of available information, and that people consider the implications of their actions before they behave. Well, unfortunately, we generally see that neither of these are true. We see that people automatically respond to their environment all the time and without awareness of exactly what they're doing. So for example, we see that individuals watching a sporting event, if a fight breaks out, more people think that the other team started it. If people are watching a news channel and they're talking about political issues, people, no matter what their political stance, think that the news coverage is biased against their political views. And we generally see that attitudes can be activated automatically, again, without awareness. And this can lead to, just like I'd mentioned, selective perception or biased perception of the environment, and then can lead to an attitude-based action. And we also, again, following with the confirmation bias, are only really focusing on the information that is confirming to our attitudes, that is in support of our attitudes. So how do we combine these two? How do we combine both deliberative and automatic models of attitudes? Well, we can do so via a dual process model. So if we think back to the dual process model of perception, when we perceive something, we have an automatic reaction to it, and only when we have motivation and capacity to do something about it do we have a conscious reaction to it that will then lead to our final behaviors or our ultimate behaviors. This is similar to what we see in terms of attitude-behavior consistency. We perceive an attitude object, we have an automatic reaction or automatic attitude appear in relation to it. And then if we have the motivation and capacity to do something about it, we will then form a behavioral intention, which will then lead to performing a specific deliberative behavior. If we don't have the motivation and capacity, then our automatically activated attitude will lead to a specific behavior. So what happens when we see some inconsistencies between attitudes and behaviors? For example, people make doomsday prophecies all the time, but when they fail, we actually see people start to double down on them rather than backtrack. And this is what's known as cognitive dissonance. It's very averse to be inconsistent between our attitudes and behaviors. We want to maintain consistency in some way, shape, or form. And in order to maintain consistency, we want to reduce that negative tension. How exactly do we do that? Well, there are two different ways we can do this. We can reduce feelings of dissonance by changing our attitudes or by changing our behaviors. So if we think smoking is bad, but we end up smoking, we can change our attitudes, maybe by saying, well, smoking's actually pretty cool, or the evidence is unclear if smoking is actually bad for you. We can try and convince ourselves. Or we can change our behaviors. We can actually stop smoking. Well, one of these is much easier to do than the other, and that is changing our attitudes. We can constantly think back to times in the past when we behaved in ways that were inconsistent with our attitudes. So we can't necessarily change past behaviors, but we can retroactively decide to change what our attitudes were. So we see this a lot of times occur with what's known as insufficient justification. So we talked about previously an individual turning a doorknob for a long time and then having to basically convince someone else that this was a really cool task. And we see that people who weren't given a whole lot of money to do it thought, well, I behaved in this way for a long time for not a whole lot of money. That means I must like it. So they changed their attitudes. We can see this occur in many different situations. So, for example, hazing in university fraternities or sororities, going through all these horrible tasks. If they're performing these behaviors, that means they really must like the fraternity. People going through hazing in the US Army, if they're going through all of these hard times, boot camp, for example, that means they must have positive attitudes. We also see this with raising children. You don't get a lot of positive reinforcement with raising a child, especially within the first few months of the child being alive. So if you're going through all this trouble to raise this child, not getting enough sleep, not eating, listening to crying all the time, you can reduce cognitive dissonance by changing your attitudes. Or not necessarily changing your attitudes, but strengthening your attitudes, saying that, wow, I really must love my daughter or my son if I'm going through all this trouble for it. There are some downstream consequences to cognitive dissonance and our attempts to reduce cognitive dissonance. We're actually pretty good at reducing cognitive dissonance automatically. So because of that, we often have a difficult time predicting how we're going to feel in the future after certain events happen. So we may have something really bad happen to us, maybe loss of a relative, but because we're good at reducing these negative feelings, we think we're going to feel worse in the future than we actually do. Same with winning the lottery. We think we're going to feel better after winning the lottery than we actually do. We also see something that's known as post-decisional dissonance. That's when we end up focusing on the good features of options that we choose and the bad features of options that we didn't choose. So we may make a decision on what phone to purchase because we maybe can't go back and refund the purchase or trade in our phone for a different phone. We're going to focus on the good things about the purchase that we made and all the bad things about the purchases that we didn't make. Again, strengthening our attitudes and keeping our attitudes consistent with our behaviors. For this reason, reversible decisions are not necessarily ideal. We tend to be happier with the decision when it's final, when we can't change it. If we can change it, then the cognitive dissonance really starts to kick in. We think, I do have the option of changing my behavior still. Should I do that, or should I change my attitudes? I don't know. So generally, if you're going to make a purchase and you want to be happy with it, make sure you can't return it. You will end up being happier with it. This is an interesting phenomenon that underlies marriage and having kids. Oftentimes these are decisions that are irreversible, and after we make these decisions, after we make these choices, we tend to be a lot happier as a result. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you all next time. Bye.